Rising Tide, Visualizing the Human Costs of the Climate Crisis, which opens officially to the public tomorrow, April 16th. And the exhibition, which is a collaboration between the Museum of the City of New York, the National Maritime Museum, and Noor, features the work of Dutch documentary photographer Kadir van Lohuizen, which illustrates the dramatic consequences of rising sea levels across the world through photographs, video, drone images, and sound. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge our exhibition partners and sponsors, whom you can see on the slide. And I would particularly like to give a shout out to Ninka Vandelwal for her help in coordinating today's event. It's been a wonderful partnership with the National Maritime Museum. So we are honored to be joined today by Kadir and a remarkable group of climate experts and activists to discuss the critical point that the exhibition underscores, which is the global scale of the climate crisis and what that means in terms of our own response. And to that end, from 3 different continents and 3 time zones, we bring you Sharif Jamil, an environmental activist based in Bangladesh. From the Netherlands, both Kadir and Henk Ovink, Dutch Special Envoy for International Water Affairs. And from here in New York City, Dr. Kirsty Tinto, a glaciologist at Columbia University's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, and our moderator, Barnard of the New York Times. This program also marks the US launch of Kadir's brand new book, After Us, the Deluge, The Human Consequences of Rising Sea Levels. You can purchase this absolutely beautiful book through our museum shop, and in doing so, help support the Museum of the City of New York. So please just click the link in the chat below. Speaking of the Museum of the City of New York, the museum is now open to the public 3 days a week, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And we invite you to come check out the Rising Tide exhibition in person. You can visit our website, mcny.org, for more information and to register for our time tickets, as well as seeing the full slate of upcoming programming. Some information for you on this webinar. Closed captioning will be available for this program, and you can enable it at the bottom of your screen. And before we get started, please note that we will be taking a few questions from the audience throughout the program and to use Zoom's question function. So with that out of the way, I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Sharif Jamil is known as the Burraganga River Keeper. As the head of Water Keepers Bangladesh, he's one of Bangladesh's most outspoken and impassioned environmental advocates. Jamil leads a countrywide campaign to avert an environmental catastrophe for the country's 165 million people who are already suffering the effects of climate change and sea level rise more than any other people on Earth. Henk Ovink is the Special Envoy for International Water Affairs, Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Sherpa to the High-Level Panel on Water. He served on President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and teaches at Harvard, the London School of Economics, and the University of Groningen. Kadir van Lohuizen is an award-winning photojournalist. He's probably best known for his long-term projects on the 7 rivers of the world, the rising of sea levels, the diamond industry, and migration in the Americas. Recent projects include Wasteland, which investigates how 6 megacities manage or mismanage their waste, and of course, Rising Tide, which looks at the global consequences of rising sea levels caused by climate change. Dr. Kirsty Tinto is an associate research scientist in the Polar Geophysics Group at Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. She works with interdisciplinary teams to understand the processes controlling ice sheet change, with a particular interest in the interactions between the cryosphere and the underlying landscape and geology. And finally, our moderator, Anne Barnard, covers climate and environment at the New York Times, focusing on the New York area. Previously, as Beirut bureau chief, she led coverage of the Syria war for 6 years, reporting across the Middle East from 2012 to 2018. And since 9/11, she has chronicled the human and strategic impact of US war policies, reporting from front-line areas including Iraq, Syria, Gaza, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Lebanon, and exploring global issues at home. Thank you all for joining us today. And now I'll turn things over to Anne Barnard and our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And I think this will be a really interesting conversation. I'm going to start with a question to each panelist, and then the panelists will speak among themselves for a while you will also see a large selection of Kadir's wonderful photographs on your screen. And then we will be able to take some more questions. I really was excited to be on this panel because it brings together so many of the intertwined issues that make the climate crisis both so urgent and so complicated to address. You know, Kadir has worked really hard to find ways to bring home the realities of the climate crisis and how it affects human beings. And I think being exhibited in an art museum is really appropriate because the culture itself is starting to grapple with climate change, and we've seen it become part of the daily news. We've seen it become a motivator for a lot of young people in their political and personal lives. And in fact, we've seen climate and environmental issues come to the center of politics in New York City and in the United States and, you know, across the world in a way that, you know, 8 years ago when I moved to Beirut, it was not the case. And that was one of the things I most noticed on coming back to the US, you know, to cover climate and environment. I saw how politically central this issue has become. And in spite of the difficulties of bringing together people from very different walks of life to see a common interest here, there does seem to be a growing desire to grapple with it. So now we're going to talk about, you know, the ways in which this is also a justice crisis. There's an unequal impact of climate on different parts of the world and also different communities within countries, often with the poorest and most vulnerable suffering the most immediate and dangerous impacts when they, by consuming less and having less decision-making power, may have contributed the least to the crisis. So I think what we should do is start with Kadir. I think a way to frame this question about how to motivate people is to ask, how come there have been other global crises and there are just sort of global issues that are perennial, let's say air crashes or terrorism, conflicts, even, you know, what toys are safe for your baby to play with. These types of issues seem to motivate people to really grapple with situations of imminent physical danger. And people even plan for the worst case scenario on issues that have a very small statistical chance of affecting them. Climate change, I think our scientists could comment more on this, but I think it's clear that there's a very high statistical chance that everyone will be impacted by climate change in one way or another. So what's the difference in the way we react to these different types of threats? And in your work as a photographer, are you trying to correct this gap, and how?
Hello to all. Very happy to be here, and I'm very happy that the exhibition is opening tomorrow. Yeah, I've been working on this topic more or less since 2011, 2012. Obviously, firstly, the challenge was how do you show something, how do you visualize something which is often not visual yet? So that, which is a real challenge as a photographer, filmmaker to do so. So it's the work you see is really about, I really did a lot of research on this project, really trying to find regions in the world where there is an urgency and where people are actually feeling the impact already of particularly a rising sea level and what does it do to coastal regions. But I've often been wondering, as you said, you know, I mean, you were giving a few examples, right? But even if we look recently at COVID-19, how we responded to this and how we react and how we look at the worst case scenario, we don't seem to do this with the climate crisis. And although there's overwhelming scientific proof, we still seem to think that it's maybe not going to be as bad as it is. And I'm often wondering how that happens. I mean, I'm in the Netherlands. I'm speaking to you from Amsterdam. I'm pretty much below sea level. Also the Dutch, you know, we slowly start to realize, but we can't say that we didn't know, because it was the Club of Rome back in the early 70s already who warned us about global warming, and much earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, early 1900s, there have been signs already that this was that this would be a consequence of how we are behaving and how we are developing our industries and our life. And maybe it's one of the answers is also that you know, it's very difficult to come out of our comfort zone. If there's a possibility that New York or Amsterdam in the future needs to be relocated, it's very difficult for any of us to comprehend that this could be a reality. And we all know what to do, right? To make things a bit better in our personal life. We should fly less, we should drive less, we should eat better. But it's very difficult for us to do a step back instead of going forwards. And obviously our welfare has been connected to economic growth. And it seems that we will pay a price for this.
Thank you, Kadir. I think maybe we should segue to Sharif. You have been doing amazing work in Bangladesh to get real results and to reach urgency that other countries have not reached, with like real investment in fixing the problem and even in relocating people, which is a third rail issue up to now in the United States and elsewhere. I think you know, learning about how to deal with the climate crisis needs to be a two-way street. There are many ways in which the West still thinks that it has expertise to sort of farm out to the rest of the world, but in fact, places like Bangladesh are ahead in many ways, and there needs to be some humility and listening and questioning about your experience and your expertise. So can you give us just some examples of maybe there's some takeaway lessons from your activism there that could apply to climate activists and to leaders in the rest of the world?
Thank you, Em, and thanks to Sarah. Hello to everybody. And I'm very happy, first of all, to be able to be a part of this very valuable discussion. And thanks to Kadir and other panelists. First, I want to let you get some idea about Bangladesh. You know very well, but many of the audience may not know it. Bangladesh is part of the largest active delta in the world, and it also calls the Ganges and Brahmaputra Delta. What does it mean by it? It means the mighty Ganges river system, Brahmaputra river system, and the Barak river system actually go to the Bay of Bengal through Bangladesh. That comes from China, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and 5 riparian countries are sharing this Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Delta basins. So first of all, we need to understand that these huge catchment area discharges to the Indian Ocean through Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal. But the way we were managing our coastal area, which is 32% of the land area, total country's land, and 29% of total population live in the coastal 19th district. And most of the coastal people were managed since the independence of the country through a cordon approach, which is philosophically proven to be a mistake, because you cannot block Ganges and Brahmaputra, and you cannot expect the country to be a bucket. But the way we manage the country, we have more than 139 polders in the coast of the country. We have about 2,000 cyclone shelters to protect our people from the extreme weather patterns coming from the Bay of Bengal. But these already proved to be a wrong approach that created huge waterlogging when the dikes and polders are all failed. So we need to change the approach. Since this government took power in 2008, they came up with a very optimistic and very visionary idea to develop the country economically by industrialization. And you know, the transportation, navigational transportation is a very important thing to consider when you are setting up your development plan. So government also declared more than 100 special economy zones across the country, but focusing on the coastal areas of this nation. So this is one thing that as an environmental activist, we are looking at it very closely, how the development plan is shaped up. And to develop country through industrialization, you need power. So government came up with power system master plan in 2010. And we found that the power system master plan was focusing more on coal-based power plants to be established. From 2.5% total share, it was planning to develop more than 50% share from coal, which is very devastating for a densely populated country like Bangladesh, when the water, air, and soil will be obviously polluted by these coal-based power plants, and where the entire globe is turning back from coal due to the climate crisis. This is one thing. And second thing, in 2018, government came up with a very visionary plan, which we call Delta Plan 2100. We appreciate the idea, and our government must have some visionary plans like Delta Plan 2100. But if you see deeply to the plan and projects came under the plan, you see there was not a single project developed organically from the Delta Plan 2100. All the rented projects came up here, and those are all destroying the deltaic character of the country. So in brief, what I want to say that we want to gather information, data, and we want to project it to the government as they can review their policy, and also to the people, because the community needs to know what is coming ahead of them, and they don't know actually the crisis in depth in terms of science and technology. So the global community who are coming forward to help this nation, they should also think this nation to be helped by green development and sustainable development, not like as it was planned and put in place. I'm stopping here. I will be happy to answer any question. But we are organizing people's movement. We are advocating with the government. We're giving them information. We are demanding the government to review. And of course, COVID brought us an opportunity to review the development plan. So we hope the government will review it. And already government started sensible statements by recognizing the probable adverse impacts from those coal-based power plants and other detrimental development activities. And to you.
So Henk, you have been working on water issues globally. So you're seeing some of the interrelated complexities of what Sharif is talking about. You know, just as one example, he's saying that if the country is trying to industrialize and maybe find a way for people to have jobs away from the dangerous coast, there can be a counterproductive element if the industrialization itself then speeds the climate change. So I want to ask how you saw this situation much closer to home here for me in New York City after Hurricane Sandy, which really devastated the whole city and the region. It really was a wake-up call for a lot of people in New York City and in the United States, also coming about a decade after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. You worked on these responses with the U.S. administrations. What good actions did you see? What mistakes, and how do we translate the concern that's risen by such huge disasters into really effective holistic solutions that take into account the water and nature that is not going to go away?
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks, of course, Kadir and Sharif already, but also congratulations, Kadir, not only on the book, but also on the exhibit. And thanks to the Museum of the City of New York for hosting this. Sharif is very much right, and Kadir shows it in its images. And there's an IPCC, International Panel for Climate Change, which is connected to the UN system, that actually addresses this. It's called Climate Change in Land. It was presented in 2019, so it's fairly new. And it actually tells us that everything, the majority of what we do as humans increases climate change. So that means that the way we develop our economies, our cities, our infrastructure, our agriculture, industries across is increasing climate change. And second, how we do it, the way we plan our cities and infrastructure is actually in the wrong places in the most devastating way, destroying our biodiversity, our resiliency and sustainability. So two sides of the same dark coin, you could say, that on one end climate change is increasing and on the other we become more vulnerable. Hurricane Sandy hitting New York showed, as like many disasters, like an X-ray, those vulnerabilities. It exposes your risk. With such a disaster, you actually have the opportunity to be able to see where vulnerabilities, interdependencies, but also opportunities lie. And I think we were lucky that at that time we had the Obama administration, and President Obama, when he entered office 4 years before Sandy hit, immediately said, no Katrina on my watch, meaning I want to be ready. I want to be prepared. I want to know what we can do. We can't yet prevent these natural disasters that are not natural disasters, but climate crisis disasters we caused upon ourselves, but these disasters from happening. But we need to know not only what to do in the aftermath, but also that the response is not looking backwards to the past and picking up the pieces and try to mend them, but looking ahead. So he started this Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, putting Sean Donovan of Housing and Urban Development, who's actually running for mayor of your city right now, and Secretary Napolitano at the helm of this task force. Sean was the chair. In how can we turn the disaster not in an opportunity, because that is a scary thing to say because people lost everything, but as a springboard to do better. And I think you saw a lot of good things coming out of that, but you also see that it is hard. It is very tough to change from infrastructure investment and economic development from doing things in an unsustainable way to all of a sudden moving to the bright side of the thing. So these are, alas, very incremental processes, and that is the big challenge. We don't have time for those small steps. We need to take big steps in the context of this climate crisis. So one of the things that we developed in this context was a challenge, a collaborative effort, working inclusively with communities, activist organizations like Occupy Sandy, but also institutions from the financial sector and governments and businesses in a challenge environment to say, okay, what are then, based on the assessment of vulnerabilities and interdependencies, the opportunities that can help us leapfrog towards a better future? What are the things that are not based on picking up the pieces, but holistic, inclusive approaches that actually are not only building back better, but become springboards that we can replicate and scale? That competition was called Rebuild by Design and was a starting point for building coalitions, enabling communities, building capacity from the ground up. And I remember at the presentation of the ideas, the mayor's race from good old Lower East Side, actually said to the jury, international jury, but also representatives from the federal government, saying, Rebuild by Design made us sit on the same side of the table. And I think in the context of climate change and the impact, it's the most vulnerable that are hit hardest everywhere around the world. Most vulnerable people, but also in the context of biodiversity, most vulnerable environments. If we are able to organize ourselves on the same side of the table and have provocative ideas that we can implement and scale up, I think there is hope. I was born and raised by a mother and father that resemble Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in a way. Yeah? So an engineering father and a community leader, activist mother. They passed away long ago, but post World War II, they were drivers for change. So I'm the optimist in this world that is becoming darker and darker. So forgive me for that. But I do think that optimism comes from working around the world with the people like Sharif and Kadir and others that have the capacity to provoke the dark side of our future, but also provoke the vested powers, the vested interests. And then in that capacity lie answers that if we implement them, really can have a rippling effect of doing better. And I work in Bangladesh, in India, and Indonesia, but also in Africa. And it is possible, but it is hard. It's not easy. Yeah? And small steps, of course, are not enough. I stop. I can become a little bit enthusiastic. Sorry.
Well, we're gonna come back to this theme because you're pointing to something so important, and I hope we can spend our second half of the discussion on some of this, how the vested interests are starting to act. And I think the most noticeable one is in climate finance, where some quite mainstream, seriously capitalist institutions from Blackstone to the New York State Pension Fund are relooking at their investments and wondering if maybe fossil fuels are no longer a good investment. And that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. But that started with community activism and New Yorkers realizing that, wait a minute, we can't just keep putting our savings into mutual funds that are supporting the climate crisis. And that actually led to action. And New York now has the country's most ambitious climate law. So I hope all of you will discuss this further in terms of both the U.S. Political scene trying to recoup 4 lost years under Trump. What do we do now to catch up? And also, I can't help but be very interested in our local problems in New York and the mayor's race that's happening right now with a lot of the leading candidates putting forward very detailed climate plans. But we have to bring in our scientist, who I really hope that you also have some views on this, Kirsty, as someone who's also based in New York. You study the way glaciers work with climate change, the way they melt, the different factors that are sort of exponentially increasing the speed of melting and warming. Why does it seem that the IPCC and other reports that come out, each new one seems to paint the situation worse than before, and that can lead to like a sense of despair? How can we translate that into something that connects to what's happening in our own local communities and something that we can kind of sink our teeth into and do something about?
Hello. Yeah, that's a big question. My first thought about how come things keep getting worse is simply that we're living on a trend. We know that the planet's warming. We know that the seas are rising. There are things that we know for sure because we've been measuring these things for a long time. And I often go to the records of the tide gauge at the Battery at the bottom of Manhattan, and that's been running since the middle of the 1800s. And so we can see exactly what the sea level in New York has done in the past over quite a long record, and that brings some certainty to what is a really expensively uncertain situation. And that's really where our work comes in, because I think a lot of the hesitancy or slowness of trying to respond to this situation is this narrative that there's so much uncertainty, there's so much that we don't know. And in science, we love not knowing things. Like that's what we're in this for, to find the bits that we don't know and inquire into them. And so the work that I've been doing has been doing a lot of on-site mapping of the major ice sheets of Greenland and of Antarctica. For the last decade, we've been flying over them with aircraft and measuring the year-to-year change in ice volume, and also the structures and the processes that drive those ice sheets. So trying to, with the power of extremely precise measurements, that's what I really love to champion, that we are clever. And we can measure things really well, and we're finding out more and more about this system. And the purpose of that is to try and reduce those uncertainties, or at least constrain them, because to make a responsible response to a predicted future, how likely is something going to happen, and how bad is it going to be? You have to know that, and it's very expensive to not know what the playground is. And so we put a lot of energy into just trying to constrain those uncertainties to make it easier for people to make good choices. And that's on the global scale of trying to help improve on what we know, even though the fundamentals of sea level rising we know. And then the other side of the work that I'm involved in is to recognize the human dimension of that and the variability of that around the world. It's not just big ice sheets that are changing, but in every city, in every coastal area, in different communities, the landscape is changing differently. Sea level rise is different in different places, but also the land use controls the values and the impact. So we have a project where we're working with different communities in Greenland to identify, what is the value in your waterfront and the ways that it will change. And in that area, sea levels either going up or down, depending on where you are. It's kind of interesting. And that needs to happen in all communities who are going to be affected. There needs to be a conversation about what do you value here? That it isn't just financial, but to try and take Henk's optimism and work out what we need to protect, and then be clever about the things that we can measure to improve our predictions, and be clever about the way that we change how we do things.
Well, this is just fascinating that all of you have brought up in different ways the way that now we're going to see some of Kadir's pictures from all over the world where we can see the effects of climate change. So they'll be running while we talk. All of you have touched on this in different ways, that climate change is happening everywhere. It's definitely happening. We need to do something, even if we don't know everything about what's going on. But as you said, in every community, there's different landscapes, there's different ways that people use and relate to the waterfront. There's different ways that land is valued and that the water is valued. It goes not into just economics and inequality. It goes into culture. It goes into, sometimes industries like tourism. It goes into, historical preservation in some places. I mean, it really goes into every aspect of life. So, but since you've all worked in such a detailed way in different areas, I'd love to just hear you, and you can feel free to respond to each other about this. What are some, can you get very specific about things that you've studied or worked on or seen where there was a particular impact of climate change that could be addressed, and was it addressed the wrong way, and could that be corrected, or does it inspire is there like a new exciting way that some community is addressing these changes by taking into account its local particularities? I'd love to hear you all talk about that from your point of view.
Well, if you allow me to a few minutes, then I want to give you some specific issues that we have been dealing with. One is you already got an idea about the river system of this river and delta. It's basically depending on the upper riparian flow from the upper riparian countries, and mostly from India, because we have 57 transboundary rivers. Out of this 57, 53 are coming from India. One is going to India and 3 from Myanmar. So all those transboundary rivers are somehow interrupted, or somehow there are some water withdrawal upstream, which were taken place actually unilaterally. But what the consequences? The lean period, we don't get much water. So the salinity intrusion from the Bay of Bengal is coming so fast towards the mainland that the coastal area is basically barren these days in terms of agricultural production. So there is a migration from this. Another one thing is when the gates are all open during monsoon, we get 80% water during monsoon, and only 20% water comes during, lean period. So during monsoon, when they open the gates, it just floods entire country. And lots of water come from the upstream. There's huge bank erosion and lot of displacements. For last 10 years, on an average, more than 700,000 people are displaced from the coastal areas of the country, and 400,000 of them are coming to the capital itself. So it's a huge crisis, and not only the geographical changes and geological changes and environmental consequences are there, it has correlation with the food production, fish resources, agriculture, and many other things. With this reality, we have to have our plan, which is very rightly said by our Prime Minister, that we need to know how to live with the sea, because it's almost a flat country lying in the Bay of Bengal. So blocking this nation with the sea is not a solution for this country. If you think about the example we have in the Netherlands, Netherlands is Rhine Delta and below sea level. Bangladesh is not below sea level, and it's not Rhine Delta. Ganges Delta and Rhine Delta are far, far different than each other. Ganges and Brahmaputra itself in 1 year carries more than 1.2 billion tons of silt. So the land formation is completely in disaster. And the boulders are proven to be creating more and more consequences of human catastrophe, because when the water comes in, it doesn't go out. And we saw it in recent event of Amphan cyclone, we saw it in Ayla, and there are surges coming from the Bay of Bengal. So we need to change the approach from commercial approach to the open and natural approach to protect this country in a sustainable way. So the entire development plan that we have set out needs to be reviewed in a sustainable and green fashion. And the international community should also come forward how this can be held out. Let me give you, if you give me 1 minute more, I want to address 2 of your questions that you were asking to the other panelists. One is the vested interest group are there. It's not necessarily the local group. It has a chain between the multinational corporations to the local group. Recently, I can give you an example. I was so frustrated to see that, Japan is the very close development partner of Bangladesh since the independence. Maybe one of the best development partners among the other nations in the globe. But JICA is financing for a project, a coal-based power plant project, and the approach road to the project is being made completely filling up a coastal river, which is way disastrous for the population there, because it will inundate the entire area. And when we need to have an open approach, they are filling up a river. And more frustrating is that recently I participated to a public consultation meeting organized by one coal-based power plant company, which is financed by JICA. And JICA
a Japanese company.
Japanese company. And JICA representative was not even there to listen to the public voice, which we were very frustrated to see that. This is one thing. Second thing, they are somehow giving the responsibility to other authorities and telling that, well, it is a temporary thing, we will the river will be coming back. But in Bangladesh, you can do that. Bangladesh Supreme Court gave parental right to the National River Conservation Commission to protect the river, saying that the rivers of this country is personhood. They gave legal living entity right. So you can kill one person temporarily. So this is one example of vested interest group, because it's not necessarily JICA. When they gave the money, the roads and highway contracted to a company, and they all are in an access and doing this thing. This is one example, and I'm finishing here with one good example that you wanted to know about the Biden administration. You know, Biden administration has called a climate summit, and Special Envoy to Biden administration, John Kerry, visited Bangladesh like several days ago, and he actually publicly committed the commitment of the Biden administration towards the sustainability and green development and renewable energy production for Bangladesh. And he clearly mentioned their position against any fossil fuel or coal-based development in this country. We hope it will not turn towards LNG. We want that to be renewable, like from solar, wind, or other sources. So here I will stop, but there are many examples that can touch your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, those are such good examples. I mean, this is exactly what we're dealing with, even from an extremely hyper-local scale in New York. I'm working on a story right now about the NIMBY issues that come up when the state needs to, and the country needs to move very, very quickly on a very large scale to create wind and solar power to wean the US off of fossil fuels. But each project has to go through this incredibly difficult process to get approved. And as you said, you can, even like a well-meaning international donor can do a project that's trying to solve one problem, and it creates another problem on climate change. I mean, even going back to the big dams that were built around the world in the 70s, we can't do this anymore. There has to be a way that each and every project that's done, whether it's on the level of a town or on the level of USAID or the UN, like it has to be thought through about its climate impacts no matter what it is. And the New York state law has put in a requirement that every state agency's decision about anything, even if it's not on its face about climate, has to consider the climate impacts. But is this really going to happen? How do we make it happen? So I'd love to hear from our two Dutch panelists and from our scientists about these contradictions. When we try to solve one problem, we create another, and we do have a divide, as Henk mentioned, between the engineer's way of thinking and the community organizer's way of thinking, that the engineer wants to build stuff the way the Netherlands has dealt with things for a long time. And as you've mentioned, maybe that's starting to be obsolete even in the Netherlands. And then the community activist says, we need to learn to live with the water. We need to have like visioning meetings. And then the engineers say, well, that's too kumbaya. But the ecologists and community activists tell the engineers, well, you can't solve things by just building a wall, as Sharif was just saying. So how is that playing out now in the Netherlands? And how is that playing out in the scientific community? If you can give some sort of rapid fire answers so that we can get some interplay between you, because your answers are so interesting, but we only have about 15 more minutes.
Well, let me briefly touch upon the Netherlands, because it's very interesting, because the Netherlands, up till very recently, I didn't even include in this project, because as I said, I was looking for regions in the world where people are affected already, where it's visual, what's happening. And the Netherlands is probably the best protected delta in the world. We had our wake-up call back in 1953 when there was a huge flood and nearly 1,900 people died. So we managed our coast. We know how to deal with this, and Henk is obviously an example as well of how knowledge is being shared with governments and activists and all over the world. But the Netherlands is included in the end because there was a very alarming, well, actually it was the Delta Commissioner. We have a Delta Commissioner in the Netherlands, and he actually back in 2018 asked one of the engineering companies to look at the worst case scenario. And that was actually, for me at least, and I think for many, a wake-up call, because it basically said that if the sea level would rise in the Netherlands by 3, 6, 9 feet, there will be a problem in the Netherlands, especially if it's going over 3 feet. The question is if we can still protect ourselves. We are a delta. We share that similarity with Bangladesh. So if the sea level is rising, there's a problem with the natural outflow of the rivers. And there was actually an interview recently, a couple of days ago, in one of the newspapers with the Delta Commissioner, and he actually said that there's a possibility that the Netherlands in the future could lose its credit status. Because if cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, which is a very important port, is coming under risk, that companies will start disinvesting. So, you know, I mean, we tend to treat this as a national problem everywhere. You know, it's the problem of the Pacific nations, it's the problem of Bangladesh or the Netherlands or the US, but obviously it's a global issue which needs to be addressed. Not to mention the number of people who will have to relocate or flee from coastal regions.
Kirsty, can you respond to this at all? I mean, how, as you mentioned, with the uncertainty, how can countries make decisions about what is worth doing in terms of engineering? Like, no, if you do ambitious engineering and then it's overtopped by rising seas, you know, it becomes sort of paralyzing. Countries feel like they might have only one shot financially to do these things.
Yes. As you were asking the question, it fired off a lot of thoughts about the way that we find things out, because, you know, a small field program investigating some localized process is extrapolated out to make these global scale models, and there is tension of values of the small versus the big, and we know the foot of sea level rise that New York's experienced in the last century. And then
what is it? Can you tell our audience?
Yeah, it's been a foot in the last century. You can see that from the tide gauge that's online. But we know things like that, and then we talk about local values, and sometimes the local value is, I don't want this thing in my backyard. So we need to have a global perspective, a national perspective, at the same time as bringing the intelligence of the place that we live. There's a thing that I find very positive is a program that we're working with the National Science Foundation that is prepared to go a little slower in order to bring together some more voices to the question. And this is in the Arctic. But there's a very long history of resilience of Arctic peoples. And there is, I think, a growing attention being given to listening from that side, and being like, how do we do this? And it's difficult. You know, we use words like crisis and emergency, and you want to respond right now. And there are some things that I think that we can do right now, but the slowness of conversations and consensus and not making hasty mistakes is a real tension.
Now,
I think that's very well said.
And let me help Kadir with one information, which is the Dutch Delta Commission came up with the solution. And they are now working to allow room for the rivers. It's a new thought came from the Dutch Delta Commission, which is you need to give more room for the rivers. As they can accommodate more water, there should be floodplain, there should be foreshore. But in turns, if you see Bangladesh, we are closing down the rooms for the river. We are just destroying the floodplains. We are killing the foreshores. So the solution for us will not be exactly same as the Netherlands, because Netherlands is below sea level. We are not below sea level. Netherlands is Rhine Delta that does not carry that much silt. We are Ganges Brahmaputra Delta. We have huge silt. So we need to expedite and help land reclamation and land formation. And we need to give the natural rooms that we have in our floodplains and foreshore. So the room for rivers idea of Dutch Delta Commission should be strictly followed by the newly formed Delta Council in Bangladesh, which is not reflected in the projects they adopted under the Delta Plan 2100. Rather, it's adverse we are seeing. Sorry for interrupting, Anne.
Well,
Can I?
Go ahead.
Can I build on this? Yeah,
yes.
Because I think this steps into what is the scale. And the scale is a system scale, not a territory scale. And the river is a good metaphor for that, because it combines not only environmental and ecological system, it also combines economic and social systems. It is where people live or build their houses and so forth. But that does mean if you take a riverine approach, you have to tailor it, because every river is different. And you have to really, really value it, we would say. Yeah? You have to really care for all its values, not only its economic, but more importantly, its environmental, social, cultural values. And that is of critical only in such a comprehensive way, making room for rivers actually works. Because what we see around the world, a devastating impact of massive, stupid infrastructure impacting our riverine systems with dams and levees and so forth. If you put a dam in a river, you kill the river. Sedimentation flow stops, there's a whole impact on the environment and social structures along that. So thinking along this narrative Sharif puts in is the program in the Netherlands, Room for the River, actually started in the 70s. So that's a long time ago, where we were thinking, this delta is complex. And we want to live here, we have an economy, we want to build cities, but we also see an environmental system. So we started to assess risks and opportunities and interdependencies. 1995, we got a massive disaster. We had to evacuate 250,000 people as a wake-up call, saying, these riverine systems that we made turned into channels actually should become rivers again. Although they're different than in Bangladesh, turning the channel back into the river was of critical importance. And that started to bring forward this Room for the River. If we look at the Mississippi in the US, it is not a river, it is a channel. It is totally fabricated. And because of that, you see land subsidence. You see the disappearance of the coast of Louisiana. A football field an hour is gone. So it's not sea level rise that is actually the biggest threat. It's climate change with all these disasters, but it's man-made vulnerability, the climate change and land report by the IPCC, that actually rapidly increases our vulnerability. But if we do it differently,
the big floods last year.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. So the systems approach, using the river as your backbone for a socially just, inclusive, environmentally just, comprehensive, and then economically sustainable way is possible. It's amazing.
Well, let me just interject here, and you can continue after this interruption, Henk, because you're getting to this exact point, I think. But we have a great question from the audience from Ron Schiffman. He's steering us back to what we said we were going to mention, and we have started to mention, is environmental justice, racial and economic equity have to be included in the solutions. As Henk said before, we can't just build it back. We have to transform and build something new that doesn't just replicate the old problems. So how do we make sure that the changes aren't actually just Trojan horses for short-term gain by global financial forces? Just what we see in housing in cities. It's great that we've expanded access to our waterfronts, but if we've just done it for the rich and we've created a lot of stranded assets in areas that are soon going to be flooded, that doesn't help anybody in the long run. Are we financializing the question of climate change? On the one hand, it's good to talk about divestment. On the other hand, it's not the only thing, is it? The markets and market forces can't do this all alone. So how do we keep racial and economic equity in this process? River is a great metaphor that all these inputs are coming in, and we all have had to learn that we're thinking about a watershed, not a single country or county or city. We're talking about, a holistic mix. So let's talk about the metaphor of that. Now we have to keep thinking about the economy and racial equity and political conflict. Each of you give me maybe a few sentences on your thoughts on how we can, address this?
Well, 30 seconds. We are under environmental racism because the coal-based power plant India is building inside the Sundarbans. It's 4 kilometers away from the ecological critical area of the largest single-tract mangrove in the world, which is Sundarbans World Heritage Site, that their code did not allow it to be built in India.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you see the Japanese plant I was telling you, the emission from air pollution, it will come from those plants is 20 times higher than the standard there in Japan. So these kind of things are happening with this country. That's not acceptable. And nobody is, no, I mean, like common people does not have any, don't have any idea about these things. And our policymakers are also, up to some extent, are ignorant about those data analysis and the global changes. So we are from society trying to help the government, but at the same time, global community has their own responsibility when climate call is not necessarily a call for the coastal nations, it's a global call.
So you're saying that the richer nations of the world are willing to see pollution and climate impacts in other countries that they wouldn't be willing to see at home, and we see that on a more local level, of course, in our cities.
There is a transformation going on globally from fossil fuel to the renewables to save the planet and people, and that transformation may be in need to have some buffer zone, and that's why they have chosen some poor nations like Bangladesh to transfer the technology or the buffer time for the transformation. But for Bangladesh, it's highly impacting human health. It's a catastrophe. You know, like a coal-based power plant in Australia or in the US and a coal-based power plant in Bangladesh are not same. There are more than 1,084 people living in 1 square kilometer here, where it is only 30 in the US. So we need to think about the climate justice. And finishing with one important example that our Dutch friends should know, which is with the polders and the sluice gates we made from mid-70s with the recommendation from Dutch consultants are all ineffective now because those sluice gates are non-functional. There are seals and the gates are not being openable now. So we need to learn from the examples we have, and we need to form our development plan together with the people here and listen to the people. People should come in front from the policy making process to the implementation phase. That's what is very much lacking here.
I think Sharif's comment is actually a wonderful concluding thought for the panel, but I would like to hear just a 2-sentence wrap-up thought from each of you, if you want to build on what he said or.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would, you know, if you put it in a broader perspective and being traveling to all these different nations and specifically working in the Pacific, where people feel completely left out. I mean, we're talking about Pacific nations like Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, nations which probably will not survive this. And people are obviously angry and they don't understand. And that's the issue at all the climate summits is who's going to pay for this? Why are we paying the highest price where we have 0 emissions and we are about to lose our country and culture? And, you know, I mean, I think there's one family from Kiribati or Tuvalu who tried to get asylum and who was granted asylum, I believe, in New Zealand. But as a climate refugee, it's not in the books yet. You cannot get asylum on those grounds. And I think in that sense, it's something urgent, which really urgent, which needs to be addressed.
That underpins or underlines again Sharif's call, a people-centered climate activist approach. Fact-based, we need scientists to help us guide the way, not only emotions. And the loss and damage discussion in the context of the UN, which is about, hey, who's going to pay, is of critical importance. And then again, I was happy to hear former Secretary of State John Kerry, now Special Envoy for Climate, say at our Climate Adaptation Summit, the loss and damage issue is something we have to take very serious and bring to COP26 in Glasgow. So you need that type of leadership too, where we address these wicked challenges. But this is also not going to be easy. But we have to change course very fast because we're all going to waste and the most vulnerable are going first. So we really, really have to up our game rapidly.
And I would say, as my last thought from the science perspective, you're never going to understand what you're not looking at. And so we've talked about how complicated this situation is and who needs to be considered and listened to and what needs to be measured. And I think it's important to have conversations like this.
Yeah, as Donald Rumsfeld said, and should have listened to himself more, you have to think about your unknown unknowns, and you're only going to find those out by talking to other people from other perspectives and disciplines and places. So thanks very much, and we'll turn it over to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Kadir, Henk, Sharif, Kirsty, Anne. Wow, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you again to our supporters and partners. Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. The important issues that are being discussed here, we will look forward to continuing the conversation in future programs and in the gallery. So we invite you all to visit Rising Tide at the Museum of the City of New York. And we hope to see you again online or in person soon. Thank you to everyone.